Today I'll talk you through the things I wish I'd thought of when I set my tank up 4 years ago, and I'll tell you the mistakes that I think I've made that I wouldn't repeat if I were to strip this tank down and start again, or upgrade to a bigger tank. Now I should start by saying I absolutely love the way my tank has turned out, and I am still happy with it. But as hobbyists we always look at our tanks with a critical eye, and as long as that doesn't get in the way of your enjoyment of the hobby, I think that's a good thing because it continuously drives you to want to do better. The first mistake I've made is a coral that I'm no longer happy with, plating Montiporas. Now I've already removed a large Montipora undata, which was an absolutely beautiful coral, but it had already started to take over the rockwork and started to sting and kill other corals nearby. Now I do love plating Monties, they give you a slightly unusual growth pattern, they look absolutely fantastic, and they are pretty easy to keep. But the downside of a plating Monty is that they don't just plate out, they also encrust onto your rockwork. And that makes it incredibly difficult to remove them once you've put them in place. As well as the Monty Undata, I also have this LA Lakers plating Monty and the Tropic Thunder plating Monty. And I even made a second mistake with the Tropic Thunder, in that I placed it where I thought I wanted it to start with, then decided to move it somewhere else, and then a few months later decided to move it to one final place. Now on the face of it there's nothing wrong with that, but each time I moved it I left a small bit behind on the rockwork that I decided I'd deal with later, but never got around to. And that now means that I have 3 of the exact same coral on each of my 3 islands, which I'm not particularly keen on because it takes away a little bit of the variety I like to have, but also because they are fast growing and quite aggressive SPS corals, it means that I have 3 chunks of rock where the plating Monty is starting to try to kill its neighbours and wipe out the SPS corals nearby. Now that's of course my fault because I should have removed the whole part of the coral when I moved it each time, but because they grow so quickly and encrust over the rockwork, it's very difficult to fix the problem if you don't pick it up right from the start. So if I were to start again, I'd either do away with plating Monties altogether, or perhaps more likely, give them their own little island that they can take over and do whatever they want. I'm also finding that my aquascape is restricting flow a little bit. Because I have 3 islands that aren't really offset and are directly in a row, there isn't an awful lot of flow in between the bommies. And I much prefer the idea of a more open scape, so there are fewer still patches in my tank. And since I've set this tank up, I've seen some absolutely fantastic aquascapes that I would love to have in my own tank. They all still have loads of space for fish to hide, but importantly they don't act like a big wall and simply block the flow in my tank. Now I could get around that with strategic placement of additional power heads, but that starts to make the tank look a little bit busy and I'm not massively keen to do that, so I think it would have been preferable to start with a better scape that allows for more flow and increases my options in terms of SPS coral placement. And having 3 islands has made the tank look a little bit cramped now it's grown out. Now part of that is that the fish don't have so much swimming space because there is rock and coral everywhere you move. But from my own personal aesthetic point of view, I'd rather have a little bit more negative space without having to sacrifice hiding places for my fish. Related to that, I would have ideally had a wider tank. Now this tank is 2 feet front to back, which is pretty generous and does give good space to create a really nice aquascape. But there are a couple of tanks on the market now that appeal to me a lot more in the form of the Waterbox LX range and the Elos XL range. Those 2 tanks are an extra 6 and 8 inches wider than my tank respectively, which would allow me to have a much better aquascape with more swimming space for fish and more coral placement for me. Now my scape is quite low down and it only reaches up to about halfway up this 2 foot tall tank. And that was deliberate as I'm not a big fan of having steep angles in tanks. But if I had a tank that was 6 or 8 inches wider, I would be able to create a much higher scape without going too steep on the angles, which I think would look absolutely awesome when it's grown out and would look like a real life coral reef. The downside of those 2 tanks is that they are ruinously expensive and about 3 or 4 times as much as I spent on my tank, which was already at the top of my budget at the time. But as I get deeper and deeper into the hobby and more obsessed, I find that budget starts to go out the window. Returning to corals, and I think I've also made some poor choices in terms of specimen selection. Now what I've found 4 years into this tank is that the corals I like the most are either really colourful or really bright and glowing. For example, this Jack-o'-lantern Leptoceras glows so bright and beautiful that if I took my roof off I bet you could see it from space. Conversely, this blueberry wine aquapora is just blue and green and it doesn't glow at all. But despite the fact that it doesn't glow, it's really bright and colourful and still looks absolutely fantastic. Conversely, on the next island across, I have 2 kind of greeny teal aquaporas and a branching Cyphastria. They're neither bright nor particularly colourful, and because of that I find them quite boring, and there's no real contrast between the corals, so it creates this rather boring and uninspiring clump. Now on the new bummy I set up a few months ago, I've done a much better job of selecting corals that are not going to be boring. And I've stuck with the mantra that they either have to be bright, colourful, or bright and colourful. And because that new island looks so good already, it's got me thinking about ripping out the other one to the right and starting again. I'd also consider whether or not I want zoas in my next tank. I have 2 rocks that are away from my main rock island that are completely dedicated to zoas and nothing else. Now they look absolutely fantastic, my clownfish love sleeping in them, and the zoas haven't spread anywhere else because I've managed to keep them isolated. However, a big part of the reason they haven't spread elsewhere is because I frag them so often because they just grow so quick. And even though I frag them regularly and have them isolated on their own island, I have recently seen a couple of heads of utter chaos popping up the other side of the tank. Now I don't think they're going to take over the island where they've landed, and they don't seem to be causing any bother to my SPS, but my idea of starting up a zoa garden in the first place was to have several different zoas with contrasting colours, but the reality is that my laser lemon zoas are the dominant force and have pretty much taken over the entire zoa garden. The final change I think I would make is to have fewer fish. Now I absolutely love having loads of fish in my tanks, and it's been a signature of every tank I've had. But as my tank has grown out and got busier and busier, there is less space for fish, and it started to look a bit overcrowded. Now combine that with the fact that these fish breathe throughout the night when there's no photosynthesis happening, which means more CO2 in the tank and a lower pH, which gives me a greater pH swing than I'd like. Now that last point would be a really difficult call for me because I love the colour and movement fish bring, as well as the awesome quirky little personalities. So if I were to start again, I'd take my time and first off choose only the fish I absolutely love and see how long I can resist going big. Now while these issues are big enough to genuinely bother me, I'm not sure they're big enough to make me strip down my tank and start again. But I'd love to know what you guys think, so let me know in the comment section below what you guys would do differently, and if you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for next week, and until next time, happy reefing.